Hello and welcome back to AP Environmental Science. We're in Chapter 3 right now talking about ecosystems and energy, and today we're going to talk about all the chemical transformations that both matter and energy goes through in order to pass through the food chains. And so remember from last time that all the energy on Earth is pretty much coming from the sun, and then it's going through these different reactions to get to the higher trophic levels, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So in order for energy to pass through an ecosystem, you need a couple of things to happen. First of all, the producers have to convert that energy coming from the sun or coming from thermal energy into food, which is chemical energy. So that's going to happen through one of two processes, either photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, and photosynthesis is much more common. And then both those producers and everybody else in the food chain needs to break down that food that's been made in order to release energy, and that's going to happen through the process of cellular respiration. We need to know about each of these processes, so you need to write down the chemical equations. That's something you'll have to have memorized. Also know what each of those compounds in the chemical equation is, so you have the words there to explain it. So let's start with photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is usually happening in plants, but it can happen in any photosynthetic autotroph, so that could be things like cyanobacteria or algae as well. And if you look at what's happening in photosynthesis, they're taking in water, and that's usually coming from soil. They're also taking in carbon dioxide, usually from the air, and then they're using the energy from sunlight in order to transform these things into glucose, which is a simple sugar, and oxygen. And the glucose becomes the food for the plant or for whatever eats the plant. So really the purpose of photosynthesis is to make food. Please be careful, don't tell me that it's to make energy, because this process does not make energy, it actually uses energy. A byproduct of the process is oxygen, but that's kind of just a coincidence. It's really good for us because we get the oxygen to breathe, but that's not why the plant's doing it. The plant's doing it to make food. The plant actually uses pigments in its chloroplasts that are known as chlorophyll. You've probably heard of them. That's what actually absorbs that energy. And the energy is needed to power this reaction. Without that energy, it wouldn't happen. All right, so I really want you to just think about photosynthesis for a second and think about this question. Where does the mass of a tree come from? So this is a question that they posed to students at the graduations of Harvard and Yale, and much like that one that we saw earlier about what causes seasons, most of them could not answer it correctly. So this is something I want you to really think about for a second. If you think back to the photosynthesis equation, this is where they're getting all their food from. So this is basically where all their biomass is coming from, this process of photosynthesis. So we know that their mass has to come from something over here. And there was an experiment that kind of helps us to see this as well. And this was done by a guy named von Helmont way back in the 1600s. And basically what he did is he grew a plant and he measured the mass of the soil before and after growing it, because at that time it was thought that most of the mass of a tree came from the soil, and a lot of people still think this is true. But if you look at his data, you see that in that entire time, those 5 years, the mass of the soil only changed by 1 pound, but the mass of the plant changed by quite a bit more. And what this shows us is that the mass of a tree is not coming from the soil. All right, so that's really important. It does not come from minerals in the soil. It does not come from those nutrients. It's not coming from stuff they're absorbing that way. Where the mass of the tree is really coming from is these reactants in photosynthesis. And we need to kind of look at, okay, would it come from mostly water or would it come from carbon dioxide? Because remember that these things are combining to make sugar, which is really what's going to wind up building most of the plant's body, and oxygen, which is released. So this is not staying in the body. So most of the mass of the plant is actually coming from this compound, and we want to know where that originates. So if you actually do the math, and if you've taken chemistry, this is something that you should hopefully be able to do, or at least by the end of the year. What we can find out is that the biomass of the tree is coming mostly from carbon dioxide that it's taking out of the air. So this is a tough thing for people to get because you don't think of air as having mass, but it does, just like anything else. And if you do the math, you'll find that 6 moles of CO2, which is really what's represented here, and a mole is just a measurement of molecules, that much weighs 264 grams. If we look at the same amount of water, 6 moles of water, it only weighs 72 grams. So there is some of the mass of the plant that's coming from that water, but the vast majority of it is coming from that CO2. And that's something that you want to keep in mind. That's where biomass in the food chain is really originally coming from. It's coming from the air, and it's being transformed by this energy input from the sun into these chemical molecules of glucose that can then be worked with more as food. There's another process that you need to know, again, know the equation, and that is chemosynthesis. And this happens in places where there is no sunlight, so they can't perform photosynthesis. So this is mostly actually happening in hydrothermal vent food chains down in the bottom of the ocean where sunlight doesn't penetrate. And the energy from this is coming from the Earth's interior because at these hydrothermal vents you have magma bubbling up. And it releases these hydrogen sulfide compounds. And these organisms, which are usually bacteria, are able to transform the hydrogen sulfide as well as CO2 that's in the water and water itself into glucose. And a byproduct of this is sulfuric acid. So these are very dangerous places for certain organisms that aren't adapted to live there, but there is a whole food chain down there that depends on that. And you don't see any algae, you don't see any plants or anything that's photosynthetic. It's these bacteria that actually live inside some of the other organisms, like the tube worms, that are creating all of the food for this entire ecosystem. So it's pretty interesting. So take a second, kind of compare what happens differently in chemosynthesis versus photosynthesis. This is something that you need to know the difference between. All right, so both of these processes make food. Now, once you have that food, you have to get energy back out of it. So usually the process that organisms use to do that is called aerobic respiration, and this is the equation for it. They'll take that glucose and they'll take oxygen, and I want you to notice these were the products of photosynthesis. Now they're going to become the reactants of respiration, and they use these to make water and carbon dioxide. These are both technically waste products, and to make ATP, which is the way that organisms get energy in their body is through this molecule of ATP. So it makes 36 ATP, and it also makes some waste energy, which is in the form of heat. So this is how organisms are getting energy to do everything else in their body. And because this is the only way they get energy, this has to happen in absolutely every organism, including plants. Make sure you know that. They don't just do photosynthesis, they also do respiration. And this is usually going to occur in the mitochondria of their cells. In any eukaryotes, remember eukaryotes is anything with a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. And in prokaryotes, since they don't have those membrane-bound organelles, it will happen in their cytoplasm. But either way, all organisms have to perform respiration in order to get energy in the form of ATP. Now I want to pause for a second and go back to this idea of ecosystem productivity. So this was in your last lecture, and this equation went up, and this is an equation that you need to know. And one of the things I want to point out is that when we talk about the productivity of all the producers in an ecosystem, the amount of energy and biomass that they're producing altogether is going to be the net primary productivity. And in order to calculate this, we have to take their gross primary productivity, which is basically how much photosynthesis they do and how much sugar they make. And we have to subtract their respiration from that, because remember, they're using some of this food for themselves to get energy for the producer itself. So that's why you see this subtracted in this equation to get the total productivity of the ecosystem as a whole, because they're using some of that energy. So this is just the energy that's left over. You can think of this as a rate at which producers capture energy. And the most productive ecosystems are going to have those ideal conditions for photosynthesis so that this number is really high because there's going to be lots of light in those ecosystems, lots of water, lots of all of those reactants for photosynthesis. I also want to talk about the ATP molecule really quick. This is basically the equation that happens during respiration. You have these molecules in your cells already of ADP, and this is kind of like a partially charged battery, and you want to charge it up. So what respiration does is it helps to add this phosphate here. So the energy that's coming from the sugar, the glucose that's being broken down, is being placed into a bond right here so that you get this third bond on there. And that bond holds a lot of energy, and it basically charges up your battery for your ATP and makes it so that you have plenty of energy to perform all the other processes. And then this molecule will be used for what we call secondary productivity. And basically, secondary productivity is all of the biological work that has to happen on a daily basis where organisms use energy. So that would include them moving around, reproducing, getting food, growth, repairing tissues. All of those things require energy. So that total amount of energy that's required is the secondary productivity. So secondary productivity goes with respiration, primary goes with photosynthesis. I also want to make sure we understand why we breathe. So we are really breathing to take in oxygen, yes, but why do we need that oxygen? We need that oxygen in order to perform respiration. And that's going to allow us to break down our food. So without oxygen, we can't break down food, we can't get energy out of it, and that's why it's really important. The other thing we breathe for is we have to get rid of that CO2 that comes out of this equation because this is really toxic. And you actually breathe out a lot of water as well when you're breathing out. So this allows us to get rid of those extra things that we don't want in our body. Now, let's talk a second here about how efficient these processes are. So when you burn gasoline in a car, it's actually only 20 to 30% efficient. And efficient just means the amount of useful work you can get per total energy that you put in. Basically, our second law of thermodynamics, saying that energy gets more and more chaotic and less useful as it gets transformed, says that you cannot have a process that's 100% efficient. So our cars are about 20 to 30% efficient. Our cells, when they break down sugar with oxygen, are about 40% efficient, so they're a little bit better than our cars. But they're still not very efficient in that a lot of that energy is going to be lost as heat. And that's part of what you see in this equation, is that a lot of that energy does get lost, and that goes along with that second law. Now, sometimes when oxygen isn't available, your body and other organisms will use anaerobic respiration. So you can see there's no oxygen here. You have some of the same waste products, but then you also have something happening in animals that's called lactic acid. This process does not produce as much energy, only 2 ATP instead of 36. So you can't use this process forever to sustain a large organism. It's just not enough. And this lactic acid can be toxic if it builds up. So it causes muscle cramps. If it's long enough, it can kill your cells. In plants and fungi, they also use anaerobic respiration, but it's also called fermentation, and it's a little bit different because it produces alcohol instead of lactic acid. And again, it only produces 2 ATP. That alcohol can be toxic. So this is not an efficient process. This is really only going to happen in anaerobic bacteria that are living in waterlogged soil or hypoxic areas. Sometimes you have them living in animal intestines, helping you digest things, or in hydrothermal vents where there's no oxygen. But your body does switch over to anaerobic respiration if you're not getting oxygen to your cells fast enough, which is why you sometimes experience those muscle cramps. So we're going to be starting to talk about this carbon cycle, and these processes of photosynthesis and respiration are really the 2 major parts of the carbon cycle. And then there's many ways that we affect this carbon cycle as well that we'll start to talk about later. But remember that those autotrophs are storing the energy in those sugars, and then those sugars are actually being broken down to make other molecules like carbohydrates, fats, proteins. All of those molecules are being eaten when the heterotroph eats the organism, and then they're being used to make energy and also to make building blocks for other compounds that they need, other carbs, fats, proteins, nucleic acids that the organism needs for their body. And then once we've used respiration to either get ATP or get those building blocks for other compounds, we can build all those other compounds we need. And that's what really helps us grow or replace our biomass. That's what the biomass is the products of that. And all of that requires ATP. It's taking monomers, putting them together to make polymers, bigger molecules. Take a second and go over these points, and then we'll see